The story of Galusha Pennypacker, the man who would shatter records and defy the actuarial tables of war, begins not with a cannon blast, but with the quiet, heavy weight of history. Born on June 1, 1844, in Chester County, Pennsylvania, he entered the world on hallowed ground. His birthplace was a farmhouse nestled in the rolling hills near Valley Forge, the very structure that had served as the headquarters for Baron von Steuben during the dark, freezing winter of 1777-1778. It was here that the Continental Army was drilled into a professional fighting force, and it was here that Galusha inhaled the legacy of the American Revolution with his first breath. His lineage was a tapestry of martial commitment and colonial endurance. He was a descendant of the Pennypackers, a stalwart Mennonite family of Dutch and German origins who had broken the soil of Pennsylvania generations prior. Through this bloodline, he was a fifth cousin to another flamboyant boy general, George Armstrong Custer, and a cousin to Samuel W. Pennypacker, a future governor of Pennsylvania. His grandfather, Joseph Pennypacker, had marched under Washington, and his grandmother, Elizabeth Funk Pennypacker, was a woman of formidable constitution who would live to the age of 101. But the stability of this heritage was quickly fractured. In January 1846, when Galusha was merely an infant, his mother, Tamsin, Amelia Werkeiser Pennypacker, contracted smallpox. The disease was merciless. She died at the age of 22, leaving Galusha motherless in a world that was about to turn violent. His father, Joseph J. Pennypacker, was a man of restless spirit. Following the death of his wife and the collapse of his business ventures, Joseph made a decision that would define his son's solitude. He placed the toddler in the care of his grandmother and departed for the Mexican-American War. He would never return to Pennsylvania, eventually settling in California as a newspaperman. Galusha was effectively an orphan, raised by a grandmother in Phoenixville and West Chester, growing up with a quiet, diffident demeanor that masked a reservoir of steely resolve. When the Confederacy fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the abstraction of war became a tangible reality. Galusha Pennypacker was 16 years old. He stood nearly 6 feet tall, lanky and serious, possessing a maturity forced upon him by abandonment. While other boys saw the war as a grand adventure, Pennypacker approached it with a precocious professionalism. He enlisted immediately in the 9th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, a 3-month regiment raised in West Chester. In a chaotic environment where officers were often elected based on popularity rather than competence, the men of his company voted to make the 16-year-old a lieutenant. In a move that displayed extraordinary self-awareness, Pennypacker declined the commission. He resigned the title, stating he was too young and inexperienced to lead men into combat. Instead, he accepted the role of quartermaster sergeant. This was not a role for a glory seeker. It was the job of a logistical workhorse, responsible for the feeding, clothing, and equipping of the regiment. It required meticulous attention to detail and a mind for organization, traits that would serve him well in the years to come. The war did not end in 90 days. As the reality of a long, bloody conflict set in, the 9th Pennsylvania mustered out, and Governor Andrew Curtin called for 3-year regiments. Pennypacker, now a seasoned 17-year-old veteran, returned to West Chester to recruit. He raised a company of men from Chester and Delaware counties, mechanics, farmers, and laborers who looked at the tall, quiet teenager and saw a leader. This time, when they elected him captain of Company A, he accepted. His rise was meteoric. On October 7, 1861, before the newly formed 97th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry had even left the state, Galusha Pennypacker was promoted to major. At 17, he was the 3rd highest-ranking officer in a regiment of nearly 1,000 men. He drilled them relentlessly at Camp Wayne, transforming civilians into a coherent fighting machine. By November, they were shipping out to Fortress Monroe, Virginia, and then down to the disease-ridden coast of the Department of the South. The boy was now a field commander, and the school of the soldier was about to give way to the school of the bayonet. The calm of the training camps would soon be replaced by the fever swamps of the South and the terrifying roar of artillery. The boy major was marching toward a destiny that would break his body but immortalize his name. The early campaigns of the 97th Pennsylvania were a grueling test of endurance rather than a single decisive clash. Stationed in the Department of the South throughout 1862 and 1863, Major Pennypacker and his men engaged in the dirty, unglamorous work of amphibious warfare and siege operations. They operated along the coasts of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, participating in the capture of Fort Pulaski and the occupation of Fernandina and Jacksonville. This period was Galusha's true education in the art of war. At Fernandina, the 17-year-old major was placed in command of a school of instruction for officers, teaching tactics and regulations to men old enough to be his father. It was an absurdity of the era, a teenager lecturing grown men on the finer points of enfilading fire and column maneuvers, yet his authority was absolute. He sat on court-martial boards, adjudicating military law with the solemnity of a jurist. Combat was sporadic but sharp. At Grimball's Landing on James Island in June 1862, he faced his first significant fire. In a letter to his aunt, he reflected on the transformation, writing, "A battle is a strange thing. I believe it is competent to make a change in a man that will last through life." He missed the suicidal charge on Fort Wagner in July 1863, where the 54th Massachusetts gained immortality due to a bout of intermittent fever, a malaria-like illness that plagued the troops in the southern swamps. But he saw the aftermath, and the lesson of Fort Wagner was burned into his mind. Frontal assaults against prepared earthworks were a death sentence unless executed with overwhelming speed and violence. In the spring of 1864, the strategic landscape shifted. General Ulysses S. Grant took command of all Union armies and ordered the 97th Pennsylvania North to Virginia. They joined the Army of the James under the political general Benjamin Butler. The stage was set for the Bermuda Hundred Campaign, a series of battles designed to sever the supply lines to Richmond. On April 3, 1864, Galusha Pennypacker was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He was 19 years old. The fighting that followed was a relentless meat grinder. At Swift Creek, Drury's Bluff, and Chester Station, the 97th was thrown into the fray repeatedly. But it was at the Battle of Green Plains, Warebottom Church on May 20, 1864, that Pennypacker's physical sacrifice began in earnest. The Confederates launched a ferocious assault to seal off Butler's army. The picket line held by the 97th was overwhelmed. In the confused, close-quarters melee, the regiment lost 184 men. The colors were targeted. 6 color-bearers were shot down in succession. Pennypacker rode to the front to rally his crumbling line. He was a magnet for enemy fire. In the span of minutes, he was struck 3 times in the right arm. Despite the shattered bone and torn muscle, he refused to leave the field until reinforcements arrived. He was finally evacuated, but his respite was short. By August, he was back in command, now promoted to full colonel. At 20, he commanded a regiment. He led them again at the Battle of Fort Gilmer, Newmarket Heights, in September. Leading an assault, his horse was shot out from under him, and he was struck by a shell fragment to the ankle. He was essentially fighting on one good leg and one good arm, yet he remained in the field. His resilience became legendary among his men, who saw him not as a boy, but as an indestructible force of nature. To truly understand the depth of Pennypacker's endurance, we must step outside the timeline of the Civil War for a moment. We must look at the man he would become after the guns fell silent, to see that his war against pain never truly ended. The date is February 1870. The Civil War has been over for 5 years. Galusha Pennypacker, now a brevet major general in the regular army, is stationed in the Deep South, tasked with the thankless duty of reconstruction. He is aboard a passenger train on the Mississippi Central Railroad, traveling south toward Oxford. He is 25 years old, but his body is a roadmap of violence, scarred by bullets and shell fragments. The train is moving fast, perhaps too fast for the wet rails and the aging infrastructure. It approaches Buckner's Trestle, a wooden bridge spanning a deep shadowed ravine 2 miles south of Oxford. As the locomotive hits the curve, the physics of speed and gravity betray the machine. The trestle groans, then snaps. The train derails. The cars tumble off the tracks, plunging into the ravine below. Wood shatters, iron twists, and the air is filled with the hiss of escaping steam and the screams of the dying. It is a catastrophe of industrial proportions, later dubbed the Mississippi Horror. 17 people die in the wreckage. Deep inside the debris lies General Pennypacker. He is pinned, crushed under the weight of the twisted carriage. His previously wounded shoulder is nearly dislocated. His body is bruised all over. He lies there in the darkness of the ravine, trapped in a mangled metal coffin, waiting for rescue or death. In this moment, the memories of Green Plains and Fort Gilmer must have merged with the agony of the crash. He survives, but the cost is etched into his psyche. In a letter written shortly after, he questions the very nature of his survival. "My time hadn't come yet. I wonder when it will." But to understand why his time had not yet come, and to understand the iron will that allowed him to survive this wreck, we must return to the defining moment of his life. We must go back to January 1865, to the windswept dunes of North Carolina, where the boy general would face the Gibraltar of the South. By the winter of 1864-1865, the Confederate States of America was a stifled, suffocating organism. The Union naval blockade, known as the Anaconda Plan, had methodically constricted the South's ability to breathe. Major ports like New Orleans, Mobile, and Pensacola had fallen. Savannah and Charleston were sealed off. There remained only one major artery connecting the Confederacy to the outside world and the supplies necessary to sustain war: Wilmington, North Carolina. Wilmington was the destination for the blockade runners, sleek, low-profile steamers that slipped through the ocean mists from Bermuda and Nassau. These vessels carried the lifeblood of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia: Enfield rifles, saltpeter for gunpowder, shoes, blankets, and lead. It was estimated that in the final year of the war alone, blockade runners brought in $65 million worth of supplies through Wilmington. General Lee was unequivocal about the stakes, wiring the garrison. "If Fort Fisher falls, I shall have to evacuate Richmond." The equation was simple. Wilmington was the throat of the rebellion. Fort Fisher was the shield that protected it. Guarding the entrance to the Cape Fear River, Fort Fisher was unlike any fortification the Union had faced. It was not a masonry fort like Sumter, which could be pulverized by rifled artillery. Fort Fisher was a massive earthwork, constructed of sand and turf. It was designed to absorb shock, to swallow cannonballs rather than shatter. Its commander, Colonel William Lamb, had modeled it after the Malakoff Tower, the Russian fortification that had frustrated the British and French during the Crimean War. The fort was shaped like a giant inverted L. The land face stretched across the peninsula from the river to the ocean, guarding against infantry assault. The sea face ran along the beach, mounting heavy artillery to hold off the Union fleet. The defensive genius of the fort lay in its traverses, immense mounds of sand, 30 feet high, running perpendicular to the main wall. These traverses isolated each gun chamber. If an enemy breached the wall, they could not sweep the line with fire. They would have to conquer the fort one gun chamber at a time, fighting over each massive mound of sand. It was a design meant to turn any assault into a slow, bloody brawl. The Union had tried to take it in December 1864. General Benjamin Butler, Pennypacker's former commander, had devised a scheme to float a ship filled with 215 tons of gunpowder near the fort and detonate it, hoping to collapse the walls. The powder boat exploded with a dull thud that did little more than wake the Confederate sentries. Butler landed troops, took one look at the imposing sand walls, and withdrew, declaring the fort impregnable. It was a humiliation for the Union and led to Butler's dismissal. Grant was undeterred. He immediately organized a second expedition, this time commanded by Major General Alfred H. Terry, and a competent professional who worked seamlessly with Admiral David D. Porter's fleet. The armada that assembled off the coast in January 1865 was the largest of the war, 58 warships. On January 13th, they began a bombardment of apocalyptic intensity. For 2 days, the fleet rained shells onto the fort, targeting the Confederate guns and cutting the wires to the electrically detonated minefields. On the beach north of the fort, Terry landed 8,000 infantry. Among them was the 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Division, 54th Corps. Its commander was Colonel Galusha Pennypacker. He stood on the wet sand, watching the ironclads hammer the earthworks. He knew what the naval bombardment could and could not do. It could suppress the enemy, but it could not take the ground. That task belonged to the infantry. At 20 years old, Pennypacker held the lives of thousands in his hands. The outcome of the war now rested on whether his brigade could cross the open sand and storm the walls of the Gibraltar of the South. The assault on Fort Fisher was scheduled for the afternoon of January 15, 1865. The plan called for a coordinated two-pronged blow. On the ocean side, a force of 2,000 sailors and Marines, armed with cutlasses and revolvers, would charge the northeast bastion. On the river side, the Army Division under General Adelbert Ames would attack the western end of the land face. At 3:00 p.m., the steam whistles of the fleet shrieked, a mechanical banshee wail signaling the attack. The naval gunfire ceased, and the silence was instantly filled by the roar of Confederate musketry. The Naval Brigade attacked first. It was a slaughter. The sailors, untrained in infantry tactics, charged in a dense mass and were cut to pieces by the Confederates on the bastion. They broke and fled, leaving the beach littered with bodies. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The Confederate garrison, distracted by the naval attack, had shifted reinforcements to the sea face. On the riverside, General Ames's 1st Brigade, led by Colonel N. Martin Curtis, surged forward. Axemen hacked through the palisade fence and the infantry poured through the gaps, gaining a foothold on the first traverse. The fighting inside the fort was a nightmare of verticality and confusion. The Union troops had to scramble up the shifting sand of the 30-foot traverses, fight across the crests, and plunge down into the gun chambers, only to face another traverse and another line of Confederate defenders. It was close-quarters combat of the most brutal kind. Bayonets, clubbed muskets, and revolvers at point-blank range. Curtis's attack stalled at the third traverse. The momentum was fading. The men were pinned down, taking fire from the reverse slopes and the heavy guns of the river batteries. If they stopped now, the attack would fail, and the Union would be pushed back into the sea. "Rise, men, and charge!" General Ames saw the crisis. He ordered Pennypacker's brigade into the breach. "Forward!" the 20-year-old colonel shouted. Leading his men through the sally port and the gaps in the fence, Pennypacker entered the chaotic interior of the fort. Smoke obscured the sun. The noise was deafening. He saw that the attack was bunching up at the base of the third traverse. The men were hesitating, terrified of the fire sweeping the crest. Pennypacker knew that tactical orders were useless in this bedlam. Only an example would suffice. He pushed his way to the front of the column, finding his old regiment, the 97th Pennsylvania. The color sergeant, William McCarty, had been struck in the knee and fallen. The regimental flag, the soul of the unit, lay in the sand. Colonel Pennypacker seized the flagstaff. He raised the tattered silk high above his head, a beacon in the smoke. "Rise, men, and charge!" he screamed, his voice cutting through the din. He did not point the way. He led the way. He scrambled up the steep face of the third traverse, a lone figure silhouetted against the sky, holding the flag. He was the most conspicuous target on the entire battlefield. He reached the crest and planted the staff firmly in the sand, signaling to the entire corps that the position was taken. At that precise moment, A Confederate marksman fired. The mini ball struck Pennypacker on the right side. The ballistics were devastating. The heavy lead slug smashed into his hip, fractured the upper portion of his pelvic bone, and tore through his body, exiting near his spine. The impact was tremendous. Pennypacker collapsed onto the sand of the traverse, the flag waving above him. But he had done enough. Inspired by their young colonel's sacrifice, his brigade roared with a primal fury. They surged up the traverse, stepping past his bleeding body and swept over the crest. They carried the third traverse, then the fourth. The Confederate line broke. The momentum of the battle had shifted irrevocably. As the battle raged on toward the final traverses, General Terry made his way into the captured works. He found Pennypacker lying on the sand, his lifeblood soaking into the earth. Terry knelt beside the boy and took his hand. "You are the real hero of Fort Fisher," he told him, promising that he would be breveted a general for what he had done that day. Galusha Pennypacker was carried off the field on a stretcher, a 20-year-old who had just broken the back of the Confederacy. To appreciate the miracle of Galusha Pennypacker's survival, one must confront the medical reality of 1865. A gunshot fracture of the pelvis was a catastrophic injury. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion records that the mortality rate for such wounds was approximately 37%, rising significantly if internal organs were perforated. There were no antibiotics, no x-rays, and no sterile techniques. Pennypacker was evacuated to the Chesapeake Hospital at Fortress Monroe. For 10 months, he lay in a hospital bed, fighting a war against infection and pain that was as desperate as any battle. The treatment for such wounds was rudimentary. The removal of bone fragments with unwashed probes, the application of water dressings, and heavy doses of opium to manage the agony. His youth likely saved him. His 20-year-old body possessed a physiological resilience that an older man's would not have. He survived the sepsis, the fever, and the shock, though the wound would leave him with chronic pain and a limp for the rest of his life. True to General Terry's promise, the recognition was historic. On February 18, 1865, while he was still lying in his hospital bed, Galusha Pennypacker was appointed a full brigadier general of volunteers. He was 20 years old. This appointment established a record that stands to this day. He remains the youngest general officer in the history of the United States Army. The statistical anomaly is profound. He was the only general in American history who was legally too young to vote for the president, Abraham Lincoln, who signed his commission. By March 1865, he received yet another promotion, Brevet Major General of Volunteers. A major general at 20, a rank that men like Custer and Lafayette held, but Pennypacker held it while commanding a brigade in combat at an age when most men were privates. The laurels did not end with rank. Years later, as the nation began to formalize its recognition of valor, Pennypacker was awarded the Medal of Honor on August 17, 1891. The citation was brief but evocative. Gallantly led the charge over a traverse and planted the colors of one of his regiments thereon. Was severely wounded. It was the official codification of the moment he stood on the skyline at Fort Fisher, a target for every rifle in the Cape Fear, and refused to yield. He returned to West Chester in November 1865, a shattered hero. He resigned his volunteer commission in 1866, but the civilian world held no place for him. He had been a soldier since 16. The Army was his home. In July 1866, he accepted a commission as a colonel in the regular Army. The boy general was now a career soldier, destined for the dark and difficult days of Reconstruction. We return now to the ravine at Buckner's Trestle in February 1870. The twisted metal of the train wreck lies smoking in the Mississippi twilight. General Pennypacker is trapped in the wreckage, his body battered, his old wounds screaming. Yet, as rescuers pry the timber and iron apart, they find him alive. "My time hadn't come yet," he had written. Survival was his habit. Just as he had refused to die on the sand of Fort Fisher, he refused to die in the mud of the ravine. He was extracted from the train, bruised and broken, but unbroken in spirit. He returned to duty, driven by a stoic fatalism that would define his post-war life. Pennypacker's service in the post-war South was a different kind of warfare. As colonel of the 34th U.S. Infantry, later the 16th Infantry, he commanded the 4th Military District, which included Mississippi and Arkansas. His task was to enforce the Reconstruction Acts, to protect the rights of freedmen, to oversee elections, and to suppress the rising tide of white supremacist violence. He found himself in the middle of a shadow war. The Ku Klux Klan was active, terrorizing black voters and white Republicans. Pennypacker's tenure saw the Meridian Race Riot of 1871 and endemic political violence in Vicksburg. He was a martial law commander, a man of the sword trying to police a fragile peace. It was a thankless, grinding duty. The hero of the Union was now the occupier, tasked with holding together a society that was trying to tear itself apart. Historical records suggest he performed his duties with a strict sense of military order, though the chaos of the era often overwhelmed the limited federal resources available. In 1872, seeking relief from his wounds and the stress of command, Pennypacker took a leave of absence to tour Europe. In Berlin, he was presented to Kaiser Wilhelm II, the emperor of the newly unified Germany. The Kaiser, an elderly man who embodied the old world's aristocratic military tradition, looked at the 28-year-old American veteran and reportedly smiled, saying, "To the youngest general from the oldest." It was a meeting of two eras, the ancient Prussian militarism and the new meritocratic American steel. The accumulation of trauma eventually took its toll. The 3 wounds to his arm, the shell fragment in his ankle, the devastating pelvic fracture, and the injuries from the train wreck left him in constant pain. In 1883, at the age of 39, Galusha Pennypacker was placed on the retired list of the United States Army on account of wounds received in battle. He retired to Philadelphia, living a quiet life at 300 South 10th Street. He never married. The dashing young officer became a solitary, dignified figure, attending reunions and corresponding with his cousin Samuel. He died on October 1, 1916, at the age of 72. He was buried in the Philadelphia National Cemetery, his grave marking the resting place of a man who had lived a lifetime of violence before he could legally vote. Galusha Pennypacker's life serves as a stark reminder of the physical cost of the Civil War. We remember the boy general for the glory of his rank, but the reality was a life of relentless physical sacrifice. From the orphan of Valley Forge to the quartermaster sergeant, from the blood-soaked sand of Fort Fisher to the wreckage of a Mississippi train, he endured it all with a quiet, ironclad dignity. He was the youngest general, yes, but he was also a symbol of a generation that gave its youth, its health, and its innocence to save the Union.